Well, good evening, everyone. I know some of you who are in the room with us are grabbing a dessert at the table, filling your cup of coffee or tea, and I hope those of you who are joining us at home are doing the same, getting set in a cozy spot to join us tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Upper House this evening. My name is Melissa Shackleford, and I serve as the Director of Program Curation here at Upper House. I also want to welcome those of you who are joining us online tonight, and we hope that you participate with us in the personal reflection times and submit questions for Kendall into the chat. For those of you who might be new to Upper House, we are a center for gathering and learning, serving the University of Wisconsin-Madison and beyond through curating experiences that connect faith, ideas, and communities. Hosting Kendall Vanderslice at Upper House over the next few days is such a treat, both literally and figuratively. Her vocation as a writer, baker, and public theologian offers an abundance of rich interdisciplinary connections. Kendall is a graduate of Duke Divinity School with a Master of Theological Studies, Boston University with a Master of Liberal Arts and Gastronomy, and Wheaton College with a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology. Kendall is also a professionally trained baker, having learned from several top American pastry chefs. And in 2018, she was named a James Beard Foundation National Scholar for her work bridging food and religion. She is the author of We Will Feast, Rethinking Dinner, Worship, and the Community of God, born out of 5 years spent researching churches that worship together around the table, and which is for sale here tonight for just $10. She speaks regularly at churches, colleges, and universities across North America, and her writing appears in Christianity Today, Christian Century, Faith and Leadership, and Religion News Service. Clearly, Kendall has committed her life to the study of food and community formation, and I personally perceive her research and ministry to be one of the most integrated offerings I've seen for the mind, the soul, and the body. Tonight, while we are not actually eating a meal necessarily, I do hope that you are nourished. I hope you have come in thinking about the communities that you gather with, be that family, friends, or a particular community of faith, and the possibility for individual and communal transformation through eating together. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Kendall Vanderslice.
Hi, everyone. It is so good to be with you all here tonight. I'm very excited to share with you a bit of the work that excites me, and I hope that you all are just as excited about it as I am as well. So I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of sort of background of how I got to be here with you today, talking about this topic of worshiping together around the table. So as Melissa said, I did my undergrad at Wheaton College. I studied anthropology, but I kind of went in knowing that I wanted to work as a baker. I say that I kind of went to college like kicking and screaming. It was very clear that the Lord was calling me to Wheaton, and I really did not want to go. I knew that I wanted to make bread, and I thought I just want to go straight to work in a bakery and get my hands dirty, make bread, and that's how I will be happy with life. But for a number of reasons, it was clear that God was calling me to Wheaton, and I went begrudgingly. I spent the first year there consistently trying to transfer to another school or just drop out. But in time, I found the field of anthropology and just fell in love. I loved studying humans, thinking about culture and how we interact with one another, how community functions, really, how humans function in conversation and community with one another. And through that, I was introduced to the anthropology of food. And this just sort of was the first door that opened and helped me realize that my desire to work in food could extend into so many other areas than just working in the kitchen. So I went from Wheaton College. I did then go on to work in the professional kitchen. I worked in bakeries and restaurants around the Boston area. But while I was there, I also did a degree in food studies at Boston University. And I would rush every Sunday from my work in the bakery off to church, and I would go forward to receive communion, and I would still have dough caked to my arms. And then I would go to class in the evenings during the week, and I realized that in all of my classes, whether it was a history class or an anthropology class or a literature class, that when we were talking about food, somehow the topic of communion or the Eucharist came into the conversation. But I was no longer at Wheaton College. I was in a food studies program where I was one of the only people in my classes that had not only a background in the Christian faith, but that actually was regularly attending church and taking part in communion every week. And in this sort of trifecta of working and making bread in the mornings and taking communion Sunday evenings and learning about food on the weekday evenings, I thought, there's got to be a connection here somewhere. What does the bread that I make Sunday morning have to do with this bread that I eat on Sunday night? And what does sort of the dough still clinging to my body have to do with this bread that I'm being told is Christ's body and that makes me one with this body of Christ? And what does this have to do with food studies? The fact that we cannot study meals and we cannot study the food that we eat without also talking about the sacrament of communion, even among those who do not celebrate communion. So that is sort of what started all of this work, and I just have not stopped probing at those questions since then. So while I was at Boston University, I'd been focusing my research on commensality, which is the social dynamics of eating together. I was curious, what is it about meals that makes them function the way that they do? But then the more I started thinking about this research on meals and thinking about the Eucharist as a meal, I wondered, how might the study of commensality inform our understanding of communion and help us understand why Christ would give us a meal as this center point of Christian worship? So this line of questioning, it ultimately led me to the study of dinner churches, which are churches that hold their services primarily around the dinner table. I was asking, how does the process of eating together change our understanding of church, of community, of the Eucharist, and ultimately of God? I traveled the country researching dinner churches, talking to pastors and church planters, as well as to congregants in all of these churches, in order to get an understanding of how this experience shaped them. As I heard their stories and I grappled with their theology and their ecclesiology, their sense of who God is and what the church does, I decided that I could not adequately dive into this work without formal theological training too. So that's what brought me to Durham, North Carolina, which is where I now live. So that study of churches eventually became my first book, We Will Feast, which we have here tonight. And that book came out in 2019, 2 days after I graduated from Duke. It was a very busy week. And then I spent the next 9 months traveling around the United States and Canada, teaching churches the importance of communal eating. So for 9 months, I led workshops on hosting intentional, worshipful meals. I was teaching and preaching about how vital it is that we worship together in body, drawing closer to God and to others in tangible ways. And then in March 2020, as we all know, the world flipped upside down. And not only was gathering together in this way impossible, it was dangerous. The very thing that I had been preaching as the most important part of our communal life had now had the potential to kill others. There is a lot that we can learn about ourselves and about God as we reflect on this tension. And I hope that we take those lessons into consideration as we reimagine the church and as we reimagine community in the months and the years to come. I am still a firm believer that not only can we, but we should worship at the table. So I want you to take a moment and close your eyes and think about the most memorable meal that you have ever shared. What comes to mind when you think about feasting with others? Now, it might be memorable because it was so delicious, or because the company was just really good, or maybe it was a big, exciting event like a wedding. Or maybe because it was your first meal with friends since March of 2020. It might be memorable because the food was so terrible, or the night just went wrong in a million different ways. I want you to imagine yourself sitting at that table again. What did that meal feel like? What did it sound like? What did it taste like? You can open your eyes again. Our senses have a powerful ability to hold on to memories. Oftentimes, we view sight and sound as superior in this hierarchy of senses. We treat taste and touch and smell as inferior ways of knowing or inferior ways of sort of acquainting ourselves with the world. But these most basic senses, especially the sense of taste and the sense of smell, actually help us locate memory more than any other. This is why a smell can transport you back to a place or an event, and why you can so easily conjure up the taste and the smell of the meal that you just brought to mind. This close connection between memory and taste and smell is also why meals can be powerful places for storytelling and remembering, as well as a powerful platform for social bonding. So when I first started working in food studies, I was curious, as I said before, what it was about meals that made them work. It's really easy to wax poetic about the power of meals to build community or to cement relationships. The table gets really easily romanticized. But I was curious about what exactly it is that works. Does it always work? Does it ever fail to work? I'm pretty sure most of us have probably had an awkward meal or two, and we know that sometimes the table does fail to work. So what does this have to do with the Eucharist, or with Christ's call that the church eat together as an act of worship? Scripture opens with a vision of God as a gardener, crafting life out of the void, speaking life into being. After separating light and dark, earth and sky, sun and stars, water and dry land, God formed physical matter, beginning with the soil, Adamah in Hebrew, the dry ground that sprung forth trees and plants and seed-bearing fruits, out of which God formed cattle and creeping things and wild animals of every kind. God filled the earth and the skies and the seas with all kinds of creatures, big and small, and called all of it good. Then God said, let's craft one more thing, a creature in our image. And so picking up a handful of this lush Adamah, God breathed into it the breath of life. And behold, Adam, or Adam in Hebrew for human being, soil animated by the breath of God. There was, of course, one aspect of this creation that God did not call good, and that was a human being alone. So God created a partner to be Adam's helper and companion, another human to share in the delight of this magnificent creation, and to satisfy humanity's need to exist in community. And then God called it very good. This world, as God created it, functioned in beautiful interdependence. The seed-bearing fruit, the animals, and the humans all filled the earth with new life. God told these human beings to do a pretty simple thing, to take care of this delightful world, to govern the soil out of which they were made, to be fruitful and to multiply, to rest in the mutual reliance between humans and animals and soil. Later on in Genesis, God urges humanity to spread out over the face of the earth, experiencing the diversity of this world that God made, encountering new climates, new plants, new animals, developing new agricultural techniques, and in turn, forming varied and delicious cuisines. Humans were put on earth with a simple vocation: to draw near to God by participating in the harmonious symphony of this created world. This is what we were created for. We were created to delight in God by delighting in God's creation. And the very best way that God thought for us to do this was through eating. We were designed with two primary needs. First, to get nutrition and energy from food, and second, to find companionship in sharing our lives with others. We could have been made with skin that could transform energy from the sun, or with feet that could draw energy out from the soil, but instead of chlorophyll, we got tongues. And instead of root systems, we got tables. We got thousands of taste buds that work together with our sense of smell. Every bite of food engages all of our senses. Our experience of food is a combination of sight, of smell, of texture, of taste. And it's an experience that draws people together as well. Even if you eat a meal alone, which I'm guessing a lot of us have eaten more meals than usual alone over the last 2 years, even if you eat a meal alone, chances are your food was still touched by a community of farmers and cooks. And even if you grew all your own vegetables and you cooked all of it yourself and the meal never touched another pair of human hands, it still required the work of ants and bees and earthworms and microbes. Every time we eat, we take part in this mutuality of all of creation. We commune with our bodies, we commune with one another, we commune with all of our fellow creatures in this created world, and ultimately, we commune with our Creator as well. In short, we were created to feast. Some of you might cringe at this thought. For many people, eating is not an act of goodness or of joy. Maybe you have allergies, and every meal is a reminder of the danger that certain foods might bring. Eating might feel inconvenient. Or worse, eating with other people might make you feel like you are an inconvenience. Maybe you know the grip of hunger, the worry over whether or not you will eat tomorrow or the next day or the next. Maybe the very foods that connect you to your family and connect your family to home were the butt of jokes in elementary school. And now they're all the rage on Instagram and chefs are getting famous for making the same thing. Maybe you can't look at food without counting up calories and wondering how many miles you would have to run to burn all of it off. Maybe you stand in a grocery store aisle and you feel utterly conflicted because you want to pay attention to the treatment of farmhands and you want to pay attention to the care for the soil, and you are aware of the danger of the current climate crisis, but your budget is tight, and your teenage son eats 4,000 calories a day, and your 10-year-old won't eat vegetables, and your toddler is begging you for Cheetos, and you cannot appease them all. As much as the table unites us to one another, and the table unites us to our Creator, it also reminds us that the world is not as it's meant to be. Two trees stood together in the middle of that garden where these first humans lived, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God had only given the humans a simple thing to do, to take care of the world, of delighting in the world, but God had given them one restriction as well, and that was a restriction on what they could eat. Feast on these fruits of all of the trees, God told them. Just stay away from one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But of course, we know how the story went. The temptation proved too great, and so they plucked from the forbidden tree and they ate. They took this vegetation that was intended to sustain and to be sustained by them, and they used it selfishly. Orthodox priest Alexander Schmemann says that the fruit of that tree was food whose eating was condemned to be communion with itself alone and not with God. It is the image of the world loved for itself, and eating it is the image of life understood as an end in itself. Schmemann says that the original sin that took place that day was a ceasing to hunger after God and God alone. It was a ceasing to see every aspect of life as utterly dependent on an interdependent world as, in Schmemann's words, a sacrament of communion with God. Immediately their eyes were opened. With juice still dripping down their fingers, they looked down at their naked bodies. Rather than behold the beauty of her curves or the powerful ability for her belly to bring forth new life, the woman saw the dimples of her thighs, the softness of her middle. The man felt sweat break out upon his brow as the ground sprouted forth thistles and thorns. They felt shame at this nakedness they had always known as beauty, and they looked to the vegetation around them to cover up. In that bite, these first humans realized that everything God had created and called good could be used for evil as well. In just one quick meal, all of these relationships that God designed as good, relationships with their bodies, relationships with the ground, relationships with one another, and ultimately relationship with God, became relationships covered in shame. Their selfish desires disrupted this delicate mutuality that allowed for the flourishing of all of creation. And now with these cycles broken apart, the joy of new life, whether out of the ground or out of the woman's body, required sweat and tears and pain. Food and eating mark the brokenness of this creation that God so loves. But through meals, Jesus also shows us that food marks God's commitment to healing and restoration. Feeding the 5,000, making himself known to his disciples in the breaking of bread on the path to Emmaus, extending forgiveness to Peter in an offering of fish. Jesus also shows us that food marks God's commitment to heal. I like to read the gospel as a story of meals. All kinds of meals tell stories. They tell of displacement and migration. They tell of moments of plenty and moments of want. They tell of social hierarchies and family relationships. They memorialize the resilience of people history is most wont to forget. Carolina Hinojosa Cisneros, who is a Tejana poet, calls meals generational storytelling with an open mouth and a heaping spoon. The stories that meals tell remind us both that food was created to be powerful and good, and also that creation is not what it's meant to be. God chose meals as the storytelling device for this grand cosmic narrative that we are a part of. It was a meal that brought death into the world, but it's a meal that marks the healing of creation as well. When we share with one another the bread and the wine, we remember that God breathed into the belly of Mary and brought forth a new Adam in Jesus, the Word who was present in the beginning, the bread that promises that we will hunger no more, the rabbi who ate with those marginalized by society, who turned water into fine wine and 5 loaves and 2 fish into a meal for a crowd of thousands. One small meal of forbidden fruit brought death into the world. But through his death, Jesus reclaimed our eating as a sign of new life. As you feast together, he told his followers, remember this bread and this wine. Remember my body and my blood, this death that brings the world back to life. The Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or communion, whatever you might know it to be, is at its heart a feast. It is a meal that is meant to nourish, but as Father Robert Farrar Capon says, the wine elevates the meal from mere nourishment to conviviality. It marks the pleasure that we are meant to find in the act of eating. This meal is also a story. It reminds us of Christ's death and resurrection, and it marks Christ's promise to heal community while also doing the very act of community formation. Every time we smell wine or chew bread between our teeth, whether it's at the communion table or at the dinner table, we are brought back to that Last Supper in the upper room. We carry on the memory that was passed down from generation to generation, while also living out its fulfillment in relationship with others. From both the records of Tertullian as well as from the 2nd chapter of Acts, we know that the early church ate together as part of their worship. They practiced communion with their entire bodies as they feasted in remembrance of Christ and in anticipation for Christ's return, which they believed was imminent. Their churches brought together men and women from all socioeconomic levels to feast together in one another's homes. These feasts subverted the social order, and they addressed the very real needs for food and for community that existed within their community. We see this practice of eating together as worship in Paul's letters to the church in Corinth as well. Although in Paul's letter, we see that these meals did not always function the ways that they were intended to. Part of the work of the church was harnessing this God-given ability of food to reconcile relationships, to care for the poor and those most vulnerable. But even these meals that were meant for healing all too easily perpetuated social divisions instead. It's this context that helps us understand Paul's great concern around the Eucharist in his letters to the Corinthian church. When you eat and drink in an unworthy manner, he says in 1 Corinthians 11, it is not the Lord's Supper that you share. You eat and drink judgment upon yourselves. The meals that Paul describes in this chapter fail to unify a church. They fail to recognize the physical hunger of so many in the congregation. Instead, the rich feast and get drunk while the others go hungry. These meals maintain and reinforce the divisions of broader society, and in turn, they are a mockery of this very meal that was instituted by Christ. They are a mockery of the very call of the church. We are called to eat together, to feast together as a church, and then as an outpouring of our Eucharistic feasting, we are meant to see and to know our neighbors, to care for one another's needs, and to delight in this pained but pleasurable world that God has made. In order to understand how we can feast well in the midst of this tension, and in order to keep our feasting from devolving into gluttony, which is feasting that takes place in a manner that harms others, like we see in 1 Corinthians 11, then we need to place feasting in a relationship to its counterpart, which is fasting. We hear a lot about fasting as a spiritual discipline, and I do wholeheartedly believe in the importance of fasting, but I don't think that either fasting or feasting makes sense without being in relationship with one another. Father Robert Farrar Capon, who I have mentioned before and will mention many times again, if you haven't read his book, The Supper of the Lamb, you should just go ahead and put that on your reading list. It's a classic. I could go on and on forever about it. But he writes extensively about the relationship between fasting and feasting. He is particularly concerned with the ways that dieting shifts us away from recognition of the goodness of God's gifts. He believes that fasting is the better alternative because when we approach fasting, we can approach it as a preparation for feasts of all different kinds. It's the fasting that leads us into the feast rather than this overconsumption that leads us into this desire to pay penance for our feasting through fasting. Capon says that the real secret to fasting is that it is a major entrance into the agony, the passion by which the incarnate Word restores all things to the goodness God finds in them. Let us fast whenever we see fit and as strenuously as we should, but having gotten that exercise out of the way, let us eat, he says. Life without occasion is not worth living. But life is so much more than occasions, and its grand ordinariness must never go unsavored. In this relationship between fasting and feasting, Capon is seeing that when we focus only on fasting, it's easy to convince ourselves that the abstinence itself is the good. In reality, this abstinence reveals our hunger, and it reveals our need both for God and for food, so that we can then properly and fully enjoy what God has created for us to enjoy. If we only focus on fasting, we lose sight of feasting, which is a large portion of what we as the church are supposed to do. But if we only focus on feasting, then we never train ourselves to hunger. And so we never learn to really value the gift of all that feasting does for us, or to recognize the sacrifice that is always inherent in our eating. There is a fine line between wielding this gift of feasting and delight for good and allowing it to become a vice. So much of our ability to delight in creation is wound up in our reliance on one another. And our ability to experience pleasure is tied up with the vulnerability of our relationships with others. We are completely dependent on farmers and cooks and bees and soil and microbes and the weather, and as we are realizing more and more and now, a much bigger supply chain in order to eat. When that reliance and that vulnerability is tended with care, then our feasting enables us to experience the deep goodness and the delight of creation. But it's also very easy to exploit that dependence instead, turning our feasting into gluttony. In order to avoid the irresponsible use of creation, then we all too easily fall into this trap of believing that the avoidance of pleasure is itself the primary good. In turn, our avoidance of God's gifts can become its own kind of vice because we avoid what God has given us and asked us to tend with care. But when we hold this balance of fasting and feasting, then we're able to hold on to the tensions of eating in a world that suffers the ramifications of the fall, but that also looks forward to the day of redemption. We recognize the brokenness in the rumblings of our bellies, in our fears over calories and the effects that food might have on our physical bodies. We recognize this brokenness in the difficulty of tending life out of the ground and the complexity of technologies that are designed to aid us in that process. And we also recognize the inherent goodness of creation through the communion that we experience at the table, a communion with God and a communion with one another. All right, so we're going to have a short little time of reflection here. You can choose to talk amongst yourselves at the table or just to think sort of to yourself or write down if you'd like. But I want you to think a little bit on these questions. What is your relationship to fasting and to feasting? Have you ever fasted before? What was your experience? And did you see it as connected in any way to a feast? I'll give you just about 30 seconds to sort of think on it. All right, so these rhythms of fasting and feasting are still central to faith practice for some Christians. Orthodox Christians especially shape their year around a variety of forms of fast, as does the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, also has a broad number of fasts that shape the year. But I'm guessing that for a lot of us, it feels weird to think of the church somehow controlling what and when and how we eat. In part, this is because our eating plays such a different role in the life of the church today. And that's okay, but we need to be aware of the ways that the church and eating have gone hand in hand for all of church history. So we don't know exactly when and how the practice of gathering over a meal as church, as the early church did, shifted out of practice. But by the time of the rise of Constantine and the imperialization and the formalization of Christianity, this meal had become a small bite and a small sip in the midst of a service that involved a hierarchy of church leaders. Rather than subverting political power, worship reflected it. The meaning or the purpose or the right way of practicing the Eucharist has been a point of major contention throughout pretty much all of church history. Through various arguments and changes in the church over the years, we see shifts that brought good and shifts that brought a lot of loss. Oftentimes those shifts are one and the same. The formalization of Christian worship came in part because of the increasing prevalence of Christianity. This, I believe, is a good thing. It brought with it a deep reverence for beauty, and it brought structure to a growing community. But it also lost the subversive and personal nature of worship. The Eucharist has come to mean drastically different things for different groups of Christians throughout the course of church history. Ironically, it has become a source of great division, despite its sign of making us one in Christ's body. I say ironically, but really I mean tragically. This is a writing of John Calvin, who wrote that the greatest trick of the devil is to subvert the sacrament in this way. And we can see the horrifying use of the sacrament throughout the history of the church, from the burning of those who were deemed heretics by different pockets of Christians because of their disagreement on this topic, to false accusations of Jewish desecration of the host that then served as the grounds for violent anti-Semitism. We have a dark history of using the sacrament itself in a harmful manner. But even as the Lord's Supper has taken on all of these different various forms, most often in ways that are separate from this sort of original connection to a full meal, eating the Lord's Supper or celebrating the Eucharist has continued to be a central aspect of church life. The Protestant historian, is my clicker working? This is my favorite quote. Oh, there we go, okay. The Protestant historian Daniel Sachs writes that Protestants eat before church, after church, and occasionally during church. If you ask American Protestants why they go to church, they're likely to say that they go not for the doctrine or the ethics, but for the community. A community usually built and sustained around food. Meals have long been a part of the rhythms of the church. But what I want us to consider today is a little bit more deeply what those meals do to us as a community, so that then we can set our tables intentionally, whether at the church or in our homes. I spent the past 7 years studying churches that model themselves after those early Christian communities. They gather together and they share a full meal as an act of worship, holding their services around the table. Some of these communities were started specifically with the purpose of worshiping at the table, and they call themselves dinner churches. Others have long understood that feasting is so central to the life of this community that they don't really consider what they're doing as being anything new or groundbreaking or even all that odd. Eating together is just part of what they do as the church. Some worship through traditional liturgy on Sunday mornings, and then they share a meal together afterwards every week. Some of these communities meet in restaurants, others meet in gardens and on farms. Some meet in art galleries and community centers, in church basements, and in people's homes. The first dinner church that I ever attended was called Simple Church. It was a Methodist church in Grafton, Massachusetts. The church met together every Thursday night in the basement of another area church. The pastor would make a massive loaf of bread and make a giant pot of soup, and then as folks arrived, they would all contribute their own potluck offerings to the table. Then they would go find a task to do. They would put tablecloths on each table, they would light candles, they would fill pitchers with water, they would set silverware at every spot. They would create the space together in which they would worship. Once the room was set up, Pastor Zach would pull out his guitar and he would start singing "This Little Light of Mine" every single week. At the sound of the guitar, everyone would shift into a big circle around the perimeter of the space, and the kids would come to the center and they would all start dancing. There was an altar in the center that had this steaming bread that had just come out of the oven and these giant pitchers of grape juice, and the kids would dance around this bread and this juice. As the night progressed, we would start by sharing this bread, which Zach would bless and then pass around the circle. Everyone would go through the line to get their food and then find a spot at the table. Conversation would continue as we started to eat our food, oftentimes quite awkwardly, until everyone had settled into a chair. Once everyone was settled and eating food, then a volunteer would stand to read the scripture for the day or for the week, and then Pastor Zach, or sometimes a seminary student or a person who was considering a career in ministry, would stand and would give a short 5 to 10 minute sermon. The sermon would then end with 3 discussion questions, and the tables would dialogue for the remainder of the meal. Once conversation started to die down, then the crowd would shift back into this big circle around the perimeter of the space, and then they would sing, and oftentimes the children would run to the center for even more dancing, before they would close their worship with the blessing and sharing of the grape juice. The children would gather at the pastor's feet every single week, gripping their mason jars, and their eyes would be huge as Zach would lift the jug above his head and he would say the words of consecration. "This is Christ's blood shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. Drink and be thankful." And the kids would stand there with their glasses like this the whole time, and he would fill them up with the juice. And then the church would clink glasses and say cheers and would drink together in celebration. Then they would clean and they would clear their tables, they would wash their dishes, they would sweep the floor, and then they would all go home. I'm Episcopalian, so this is not how we do communion in my community. But it was a beautiful juxtaposition between the two to see that there was a similar reverence for this meal that worked itself out in such different ways. I was struck by the conversations that took place around the table: confession and forgiveness, honesty, humility, strong disagreement that led into fervent conversation with no resolution aside from the shared cup that closed the meal. As we have noted already, this concept of eating together in Christian community is not really anything new. From Baptist casseroles and potlucks to the significance of meals in Black church tradition and many immigrant churches, eating together as a church community is not new. But with the exception of the early church, eating together as a church service, holding a worship service around the table, and practicing the sacrament of communion over the course of a full meal is a sort of new and strange phenomenon. So what is it that's going on at these meals that make them so compelling? And why might we want to learn from them in the months and the years to come? In my research, I have found that there are a handful of themes that are present in most every dinner church. The needs that are addressed by this practice of eating together as a church. So tonight we'll look at 2 of the most prominent. The first is that of loneliness. We live in a moment where loneliness pervades every generation. In 2017, the former US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, named loneliness a public health crisis. In an interview with the Washington Post, he claims that loneliness takes a physical toll on the human body equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's associated with a greater risk of heart disease, depression, anxiety, and dementia, as well as impairing creativity and executive function. In 2017, he said that loneliness was just as prevalent among those living in cities, suburbs, and rural areas, in the heartland, and on the coasts. In my own research, I have observed that it's equally present among those who are single and those who are married, those with children and those who are childless, those who are young and those who are old. As I'm sure you can imagine, the prevalence and the impact of loneliness has only amplified over the past 2 years. We as humans were created for community. We hold this innate need to share our lives with others. Maybe you are an extreme introvert and you are content with minimal human interaction, but I'm guessing that after just a couple of weeks at home last year, even you felt the need for some friends. I personally am an extrovert, and when I don't have enough time with others, my brain feels like it might melt out of my skull. We were created with a need for intimacy and for vulnerability, for people who we can trust to hold onto the details of our lives. In a traditional church setting, it is entirely possible to go to church and to sit next to other people in the pews, maybe shaking their hand and extending shallow greetings without ever having a conversation that touches on the actual well-being of those who are present, without the formation of any kind of relationship. This was true before COVID, but these days, if we are worshiping with masks on at a distance from one another without shaking hands, then it's especially true. even if these precautions are the wisest and the safest choice right now. For regular churchgoers, this lack of relationship building makes the dinner church model particularly compelling as an alternative to the traditional church setting. But it is not just regular churchgoers who attend dinner church. Many of the congregants that I met at these dinner services are not affiliated with any other church. Many of them did not even identify as Christians. But they noted that their loneliness was appeased in this community, in this experience around the table week after week after week. One of the ways that these communities are uniquely equipped to address these various forms of loneliness and the different sort of forms they take over the course at different phases of life is because of the intergenerational nature of these churches. At Simple Church, for instance, there was one toddler who determined that a 24-year-old single man was her best friend. Every week, she would volunteer them as a team to sweep the floors. So while the young man worked alongside the toddler, meeting his own desire for time with children, the toddler's dad, who was a single father, got much-needed adult conversation with others who were in the church community. Teenagers would sit together at tables with seminary students, as well as the church's oldest members, and all of them were grateful for the ways that their thoughts and their insights were taken seriously. The elders of the church, who were mostly women in their 70s and 80s, shared recipes with the young men in the congregation, all of whom provided food together for the potluck table. These kinds of intergenerational relationships are really hard to forge outside of this unique kind of community setting. But through these relationships that were formed in the dinner church setting between people in very different phases of life, the members were able to see how their different phases of life equipped them to uniquely address the needs of others in their distinct phase of life. All right, so we're going to do another little quick reflection question. Again, you can talk with people at your table, or if you just want to reflect on your own, that's fine too. What does loneliness look or feel like in your current phase of life? Could a dinner gathering or a relationship with someone in a different phase of life help in some way? What could you offer to someone whose needs are different from your own? Again, just take a few seconds to think on that. Write it down if you have any thoughts. Say something to the person next to you if you really want to share, but don't feel obligated to share if it feels a little too intense for a new person you've never met before. All right. So another major theme that was addressed by these dinner church gatherings is that of food and housing insecurity. So while several of the churches that I researched had large numbers of members who were food or housing insecure, these churches, though, were very distinct from a soup kitchen. The gathering is first and foremost a church service, but it is a church service in which people eat. Unlike a religiously affiliated soup kitchen, where prayer might serve as an entrance fee for a hot meal, these gatherings were not addressing the need in order to proselytize. They were instead gathering to worship and very clear about the fact that they were gathering to worship, but then they were meeting needs of the community in the process. Through the relationships that were formed in conversations around the table, the needs of those who were present became known to those who were in the community. One church, as an example, is Garden Church, which is a church in San Pedro, California, just south of LA, that gathers, as you might guess by the name, in a garden. So Garden Church was planted in a plot of land in the center of this downtown strip of San Pedro, which is built on a hill. And at the time that it was planted, at the top of the hill was a very wealthy and expensive neighborhood. At the bottom of the hill was a neighborhood that was falling out of disrepair. And in the middle was this whole strip of downtown businesses, many of which had recently closed. And so the people who were living at the top of the hill were fighting for ways to try and reinvigorate business in the middle strip. And they were mostly blaming the neighbors at the bottom of the hill and those who were currently unhoused, who were living sort of in these downtown streets. They were blaming them for the reason that the businesses weren't picking up. So at the time that Garden Church planted itself right in the middle of this, they said, we are right in the middle of the street, and we want to bring together people from all of these communities, and we hope that maybe by getting to know one another and hearing one another's stories, it will change the approach, it will change the perspective of those who have the means to advocate for change. As they all got to know one another, their attitudes towards each other did, in part, shift. There were those who had once advocated against their unhoused neighbors, who then became advocates on their behalf. Another church that I visited, I will just quickly say, it was not like a happy, clean, oh look, we were divided and now we're all one. It was a much messier process, but it did change the perspectives and change the ways that people advocated for the care of their neighbors in that context. Another church that I visited in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Southside Abbey, had a very similar makeup of members. And one leader told me that the relationships that were formed around the table allowed her to see her neighbors in ways and places that she had never actually seen them before. She would realize that as she would drive past this one bridge that had tents set up underneath it, she knew the names of every person that was living in those tents. That when she walked by the library steps and she saw people sitting on the library steps, they were now her friends who she could go and talk to and know by name. She hadn't even seen them in those places before. It had become so just regular to walk past sort of the people who existed invisibly until she sat at a table and worshiped with them every week and realized, oh no, these are my friends whose stories I know, whose backgrounds I know. And it changed her relationship to the city that she lived in. In each of these instances, the churches did not build a church in order to feed the homeless. They simply built a church that also fed, and then in turn, both those who were homeowners and those who were homeless all began to attend together. In turn, these deeper systemic issues within the community were understood in new light by those who had some ability to help advocate for a more lasting change. Another story at Simple Church. One day, I actually worked at Simple Church for a short amount of time. That's where I did the bulk of my research, and then I worked there for about 9 months. And one day when I was working there, Pastor Zach, at the end of the service, came and told me and one of the other pastors who worked there that he told us that there was yet another family who had shared with him that they were food insecure and that they really needed assistance. And we had probably every week or every couple weeks another family who came in. We would assume that they were all just doing fine. The parents would say, hey, can we bring home all the leftovers? We don't have any food in our fridge this week. And every week we would find out about another family and another family who was a regular part of our church. And Zach made sort of an offhand comment that he said, I guess when you set a table, then hungry people come. But then as we began to think on these dynamics a little bit more, we looked into the statistics of the area, and we realized that we did not actually have an outrageous number of food insecure members for the area. And these same families were attending traditional churches on Sunday mornings as well. So the numbers were probably in keeping with what could be expected in our church, but also in a traditional church context. But the difference was that our church members felt safe bringing up their need to the pastor. The pastor that they entrusted with insight into their vulnerability and their food insecurity was the pastor who had already been feeding his members week after week after week. When a community is structured in such a way to address these particular needs, it then proves itself committed to holding on to the vulnerability of these relationships with care. And then it becomes a safe place for people to express more openly their insecurity, their food insecurity, their loneliness, their housing insecurity, their job insecurity. They can express that trusting that the community around them will work together to then address their needs. This creates a cyclical pattern of deepened community that leads to deepened vulnerability, that leads to a deepened ability to see and address need, And as that need is addressed, then it creates even deeper community through the care for one another's needs. And eating together week after week after week, these dinner churches say that they are both practicing the Eucharist, this meal that is a reminder of Christ's death and resurrection, while also using the meal itself to begin establishing this kingdom of God on earth today. They were using the act of eating in remembrance of Christ to bring healing to the injustices and the inequalities that exist today. These dinners are by no means always comfortable or pleasant or easy. In fact, oftentimes they are very awkward, especially at the beginning. When I was talking about my book a couple of years ago, I had someone in the audience who made a comment that there is a very fine line between a dinner party that is a glimpse of heaven and a dinner party that is a glimpse of hell. We've all been there before, right? There is no simple answer for what creates one and what creates the other. Different personality types, different social needs mean that everyone is going to react differently to the dynamics of a table. So a dinner party from heaven for one person might actually be a dinner party from hell for another. Most of the pastors that I interviewed do all they can to host the former. They would rather host a dinner church from heaven and not a dinner church from hell. But they also recognize that it is impossible to set a table where everyone that walks in the door feels completely comfortable and at home 100% of the time. But most of these pastors embrace the importance of awkwardness and discomfort, in part because it's a necessary part of getting to know people, but in part because it's a central aspect of addressing our points of pain, our points of disagreement, and the points of injustice. The table itself creates a physical barrier between us that lessens the intensity of that vulnerability of a group of people that might be sitting together. It is way less intimidating to sit with someone with a table between you than to sit in a circle of chairs where you have nothing sort of protecting your body. The presence of food, the presence of something to do with your body also helps to ease this tension, even as the actual process of putting something into your body is itself a very vulnerable act. This enables people to enter into the awkwardness and the discomfort a little bit more safely. In this way, any table can serve to address difficult conversations and points of disagreement. But what makes a dinner church unique is that it is bound on either end by the elements of the Lord's Supper, or it's at least bound in name and sort of pointing to its connection to the Lord's Supper. There is a commitment then in this meal to care for one another. In the language that is used around the breaking of the bread, the pastor says that just as the flour and the water and the salt and the yeast are different elements that are bound together inescapably or inseparably, this sharing of the bread also binds us together as a community so that no one member can say to another, "I do not need you." The worshipers then go from this bread sharing to the sharing of a full meal that reminds them of the unity that they promised to embrace in their disagreement. And then once the meal is over and their disagreements have been had, the community once again shares the cup. They hear the words that they are made one in the body of Christ. They promise together that the differences that they just shared at the table will not be strong enough to divide them from sharing together the cup of forgiveness. They acknowledge that though they may disagree vehemently, they have started with the premise that they will love and care for one another, and that they will listen to one another. And they acknowledge that it will be frustrating, and it will be infuriating sometimes, but in these rhythms of gathering again and again and again, they are softened to one another through their care for one another, and in that softening, they are transformed. Creating the space for disagreement in this way also creates the space for doubt and for fear, for asking hard questions of one another and hard questions of the Christian faith. The goal is not to gloss over or to minimize the differences, and it does not avoid challenging these differences. At times, there is a need for congregations to recognize that, yes, they can disagree and remain in community with one another, And at times there's a need to recognize that the disagreements are rooted in, or they lead to, the oppression of others who are present in the same church. Most pastors acknowledge that there's an inclination for this kind of surface level peace to prevail. But this surface level peace is exactly what they are trying to dismantle by gathering in this way. They are looking back to the early church as described by Tertullian and in the book of Acts. They see a church that was known for its radical subversion of patriarchy and its radical subversion of social stratification. And it was also known for its provision for the needs of everyone in the church. This is the kind of community that they hope to forge in the rhythms of their church congregations through the act of sharing a full meal together as the Eucharist. Methodist Bishop Larry Goodpastor writes that despite the many varying opinions about how the sacrament should be served and what exactly it means, that there is a common sense that something holy, something transformational, something grace-filled happens at the table. As a result, he says, the Eucharist may indeed provide a way forward and a way for this divided, suspicious world to find its way to an alternative and holy vision of what it means to be community. As we witness this increasing polarization socially, politically, theologically, we desperately need a way forward. We need a vision for how to live as community, acknowledging one another's doubts, one another's needs, one another's fears. Could it be that God has already given us this vision? Through the remembrance of Christ that we are gifted at the table? All right, so then the question is, how did COVID change things? Because all of these churches have been gathering in person and obviously could not continue gathering in the way that they had been. So just a few weeks into the pandemic in 2020, I began to observe these same churches that I had researched for my book. I was asking, what is it that they're doing? How are they approximating these dinner gatherings in the virtual sphere? Several of the churches transitioned their dinner service to the virtual setting, whether over Zoom or Facebook Live. And while this virtual meal obviously felt very different from their usual gathering, perhaps even more different than the transition from a traditional church service to a virtual church service, several of the pastors felt like their congregants were well equipped for this change, because their churches had a history of experimentation. The congregants trusted that their pastors throughout this early shift into online worship. They were used to just trying some things and those things totally failing. But they were also very patient in letting the group try different things because they were so used to it. Others told me that the closeness and the vulnerability that they had shared in person actually made it more natural to gather in a Zoom room where everyone feels on the spot all the time because you see everyone's face right there. So this level of intimacy required to worship in that way wasn't actually all that new to them. I participated in a few different virtual dinner church services when pastors of more traditional services began to ask me for tips to build community in a similar way. So for 6 months, I was running a small bread bakery at the time, and so for 6 months, we made loaves that we distributed to churches, and then the churches would send a loaf to each member before all gathering together online to break bread over Zoom, loaves of bread that had just a few hours before all been a single batch of dough. So this practice was, of course, inherently unsatisfying. We were created for in-person, embodied community. We were created to share our lives with others, the day-to-day nitty-gritty aspects of our life, not something that can be mediated well over a screen. There is no virtual gathering that can fully address our deeply human need. But here's the deal with the Eucharist or communion. It's always a stand-in a way as well. Christ gave us a meal as a way to hold on to the promise that Christ will come again. So this meal of communion, it fills us up while at the same time teaching us to hunger for something more, teaching us to hunger for this feast that is to come, this marriage supper of the Lamb. So communion is always inherently unsatisfying in that way. The community that was built around the virtual table pointed us to a deeper longing that we shared. First, a longing to share communion with one another in person. And second, our ultimate longing for communion with God in the new creation. So then where do we go from here? How do we take these lessons of dinner churches pre-COVID and then take these lessons learned through the separation of COVID, and how do we apply them to what the church and what community might look like for us in the months and years to come? I am not convinced that every church needs to be a dinner church. I am not even convinced that dinner church is the way of the future, although some of my dinner church research colleagues would disagree. What I do believe, though, is that dinner church as a model illuminates something really vital about our deeply human longing for food and for community. The ways that dinner church taps into this longing, especially for those who are not otherwise active in Christian community or community of any kind, ought to teach us about something about how we can foster community in our own churches and even in our own homes. I do believe that every church has a lot to learn from dinner churches, and I do believe that every church ought to make meals a central part of their congregational life. Especially as we move forward in the coming months and years, we need a method of addressing this loneliness that is causing so much harm. We need a method of grappling with the loss of the past 2 years, and we need a method of rebuilding community. The table is a place to do that, both in our churches and in our daily lives. So, what questions do you have for me?
Thank you so much, Kendall. Thank you to you guys who are in the room, and thank you to those of you who are watching online. As Kendall said, this is now a time for questions. So you might be thinking of your own church community, your own family, your friend community, your neighborhood, and we just want to open it up for Kendall's advice or reflection or any question that might have been sparked through her talk. And also to those of you who are watching online, please feel free to type your question in the chat, and some of our production team on this side will kind of wave me over that direction, and you'll hear my voice reading your question. So I just want to open it up to those in the room first. All right.
I have not rehearsed this question, so I'm not sure how articulate I will be. I pastor a small congregation here in Madison in a poor neighborhood, and this last summer we had 3 cookouts, and we had such a wonderful cross-section of economic categories in the neighborhood, and it was a lot like heaven. It was definitely a Jesus thing, even though I would say, other than those of us from my congregation and a couple of others, the people were not churchgoers. So my challenge and my constant question of myself is how much God talk do I bring into this? It's a different group of people every time, even though it has some of the same folks every time. There's a revolving number of others. And we plan to do it again when it warms up again someday. And, and I'm just puzzled. I mean, I don't want to impose my agenda on anyone. And in fact, I'm an introvert, so just the idea of bringing up such a intimate subject that is my livelihood is kind of scary. Yeah. So I'm just curious about your thoughts and suggestions and experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things that I think is really great about a dinner church service or a church service around, a worship service around a table is that by actually acknowledging and naming what it is and providing some structure to it helps to prepare expectations for what you're stepping into. Having, if this might be appropriate for your context or not, but being able to say this church is hosting a dinner service and people will ask, what is that? What does that mean? But the structure itself provides kind of the space and the language for you to say, like, we're eating this meal because we're modeling ourselves after the early church, because this is what Christ did. And it can be a very simple, sort of very high view explanation of this is why we're doing this. But then the beauty of sort of this worshiping around the table is that it's sort of formed out of this belief that like God is doing the work when we gather together. And so we can nod to the fact that we are gathering in this way because we believe God does something here. But then the next step is kind of on God to show up and actually build that community because we believe that this is what the way that God works and has called us to function. I also think, though, that at least in these contexts, I think if it's known that it's a church that's hosting this, I think the people who step into it tend to be prepared to hear some God talk and maybe know that like they may or may not disagree. I think that the folks who attended dinner churches that were not Christians, they found beauty in the fact that like they knew what they were stepping into and they knew that they were welcome to be a part of it even if they didn't agree. And they knew that they could kind of step back when we took the bread and the grape juice because they didn't necessarily believe it was the same thing that the rest of us believed, but the fact that they were invited into a part of the life of the church that said who they were and what they were doing, that somehow resonated with them.
So I'm one of those people that thinks that every church needs to be a dinner church.
Okay, great. I've got a lot of friends who do too.
For the very simple reason that, I just need to look at the life of Jesus as a starting point. So he starts his public ministry at a wedding, provides all the wine, and he ends his public ministry with a feast with his disciples in the upper room. And in between, he's feeding the 5,000 and he's having dinner at everybody's house. He's dinner church from beginning to end. He's relational, he's connected, which is what you provide in a dinner church environment. And I know for myself personally, all of the best relationships I've ever had in the body of Christ have been in house groups that share dinner together. So it's not a question of it being a lifestyle option. It's at the core of what it means to be church because it's about relationships and intimacy and attached, connected love. So the question I have is, why isn't everyone doing it?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you that I do not believe that actually eating together as a church is like an optional thing or a lifestyle sort of aspect. I actually do believe that if we are not eating together regularly as the church, that we cannot function well as the church. But I don't necessarily believe it needs to be a dinner church. And the reason for that is because I also believe that this meal itself also unites us to Christians of the last 2,000 years. And so we are not just modeling our lives after Christ, we are also in communion with 2,000 years of Christians who have developed traditions and practices that also shape us and teach us who God is in important ways. As I said, I'm Episcopalian, so obviously I am a fan of the high liturgical traditions and the smells and the bells and the incense. I'm a big fan. But I think that sort of in both of those, we see different aspects of who God is and different aspects of how the church can and should function. And there's goodness and beauty in both of those. And some people will resonate with one more than the other. And some people will want to continue probing at one, and maybe others will just want to experience this community. And I think all of that is good. All of that helps to bring something to the church and our understanding of who God is and how God is at work in the world. I like to think of it, so I run a membership community online, and we have a book club. We recently read the book, The Spirit of Wine by Gizla Craiglinger. So she is a theologian at Stanford, or she's now at University of Alabama, Birmingham. But she grew up in Germany on a generational family vineyard. So she grew up all around grapes and winemaking. Now she writes a lot on the theology and spirituality of wine. And we had this really delightful sort of conversation around wine about she is a big fan of everyone learning to enjoy wine, but also recognizing that like oftentimes the enjoyment of wine is seen as this kind of elitist activity. And we had this beautiful conversation of how we can learn to enjoy wine and celebrate wine on this very basic level of its ability to connect us to community. We can also, though, for those who do want to really probe the layers and the depths of wine, there is more and more that you could constantly probe, and there is goodness in that too. And in some ways, you can see more and more of the ways that God has created things. Like, you can celebrate God's creation as you probe the layers of wine. And then there are other ways in which we will never fully understand sort of all the nuance and depth to wine, and we can't all spend all of our time and money learning all about this process of growing grapes and its relationship to the soil and how to make good wine. So to a certain extent, the goodness and magnificence of wine is just God's desire to make this good and endlessly miraculous thing for God's own pleasure. That even if we can't fully experience or understand it, there is still goodness there because God just delights in the magnificence of God's creation. And so I think thinking about sort of the different rhythms of the church are a parallel to where we can experience the fullness and goodness of God and community in something as simple as a dinner church. But we can also experience the goodness of God and the depths of God and nuances in sort of studying the academic study of theology or getting into these really high liturgical services. And we don't have to, but there is still more that we can learn about God in that. I don't know if that helps answer the question. Clearly, I get a little bit excited about these topics.
Kendall, if you don't mind, could you circle back to the topic of fasting? Mm-hmm. And I'm part of a church where we meet in smaller community groups throughout the week, and we do meals consistently, but the idea of fasting has never really crossed my mind, mm-hmm. of something to do, I guess, one, on a personal level, and then two, collectively as a group. Mm-hmm. Have you experienced that done mm-hmm. as a group? And how, I guess, would you encourage someone to pursue something like that?
Yeah, so on sort of a bigger level in the Orthodox Church, there are church-wide fasts that they practice in throughout the church year. And so there are portions of the church year where they don't eat dairy or eggs or meat. I'm not fully aware of all the different layers of the fast, but that is actually a part of the rhythm of the church. And a lot of food culture has been developed out of that. So I worked in Greek and Eastern Mediterranean restaurants and bakeries for a while, and a lot of the pastries that we had were developed out of these different fasts that took place at different parts of the year. So we have all these desserts that are made without any dairy and without any eggs because of church-wide times of fasting from dairy and eggs. But of course, it's we can't really just add that back into our church rhythms for churches that are very much not sort of living in those rhythms. Again, that's a deeply cultural and church-wide rhythm. But what I have experienced before, I attended a church in Boston where over the course of Lent, we would have a church-wide fast. Each week of Lent, we would have something different that we fasted from together. So one week, we would all fast from sweets together. One week, we would all fast from media together. One week, we would all fast from extra spending together, and then the Sunday at the end of that week, we would have a special offering for we would choose something that special offering was for. And so it was not a full fast, but it was of something small and simple. Excuse me. And in fasting together, it shaped us together in community in really meaningful ways. In sort of thinking together about how do we, if you have a small group dinner on the week that we're all fasting from sweets, how do we we can connect together, bond together over the fact that none of us are eating sweets this week. How are you doing not having sugar in your coffee or what have you? On a flip side, another way that I saw this kind of work its way out, at one point I worked in a restaurant that was in a highly Catholic part of town. So in the restaurant industry, oftentimes when you work a dinner shift together, you share a staff meal. So before dinner service begins, someone in the kitchen makes a meal that everyone sort of eats the same meal together right before you go into dinner service. And so over Lent in this season, several people were fasting from something for Lent, and everyone sort of had something different that they were fasting on. But we ended up all knowing what one another was fasting from because whoever made the family meal had to take it into account what everyone else was fasting from. So there was kind of this season where it was like, oh, well, we got to make something without cheese because Phil's not eating cheese. And we got to make something without gluten because, this person's not eating gluten. And so even though we weren't necessarily fasting together or fasting from the same thing, the fact that we were fasting sort of became this point of connection and figuring out the meal that we would be sharing. And I think before that point, we had never broached the topic of religion at all in that kitchen. It's not exactly something you talk about in kitchens. And so that was just a really cool way to see that our fasting could actually serve as a point of community formation. Yeah.
Just one note on fasting. I want, for a small, short season, I gave up chocolate on Wednesdays. And whenever I went to get the chocolate, I remembered that it's God who satisfies me. Mm-hmm. And that made fasting meaningful. Because as a Protestant, fasting didn't mean anything to me. But that one, whoever told me that one aspect of it really helped make it meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy to think that fasting needs to be this full giving up of food altogether in order to get any meaning. But even that falls into this idea that it's the abstinence that is good. But it's not the abstinence that is good. It is by giving something up every time we then hunger for that thing or reach for that thing, it reminds us of wait, I am practicing something to point me towards God. And then when I do participate in that thing, it heightens the joy of that experience, that feast.
Kendall, I have a question. I know at one point in your talk you said something about not, you didn't use this phrase, but not having the magic sauce to make it a dinner church service from heaven. But I imagine that you have observed a lot of best practices in the different types of communities that you've observed or participated in. And I'm even thinking about just hosting in home setting. So I'm wondering if you could just reflect on, I'm thinking of even how to turn a dinner party into a dinner service if you're someone just hosting friends in your home. And what are some of those next steps you can take to really make it a communal conversation, whether it's about God or inviting God talk, as someone mentioned earlier, or just, centering that differently.
Yeah, so a couple of the simplest things are, they're almost so simple that it's oh, why didn't I think of that? But even just having a little bit of low volume background music and having the lights slightly lower makes a huge difference. Because when you are in the place with totally bright lights or total silence apart from the sound of people talking, it can be very awkward. Because then whoever talks, everyone hears that person is talking. You can't just, in a conversation question, you can't just turn to someone and start talking because everyone else in the room knows, and someone's got to start. But with that low-level music, then it becomes easier for people to talk with one another and not feel quite that sort of same charge. And same with lower lighting in the house. So those two are very simple things. Another is having some set discussion questions, and not necessarily this is what we're going to talk about at this time, but some ideas in mind of if conversation lulls, what's something that I can bring up? What are some questions or topics that I can bring up around the table, or even asking people to bring their own sort of questions is another helpful way. So the precursor to my dinner church research, I did this research project on where I held a series of 4 different meals with 4 different women that did not know one another. And so every week I gathered this same group of women, and then they had committed to observing together how they felt this process of getting to know one another. And so we did slightly different things at each meal, but the first meal was so awkward because I had thought, this is the first meal of this experiment. I've invited them into this very weird thing, and they have agreed to help me do this. I want to treat them. So I set my home really nicely. I cooked the whole meal, and I just had them show up. And it was the most awkward of all the meals because they all just sort of showed up to this formal environment and didn't know what to do and what to say. But then the second week, we all cooked together, and each of them brought a recipe and the ingredients. And then it became the sort of point of connection of they got to share, oh, this is where this recipe came from and what this means to me. Their bodies were busy as they were cooking by preparing the meal together and the space together. and sort of naturally bringing these stories in the form of their recipes went so much further to creating a hospitable environment than me actually trying really hard to create a hospitable environment in my home. So I think even something as simple as like if you have a dinner party, ask everyone to bring something. You might feel like, oh no, I'm the host, I want to provide everything. But letting people contribute goes really far to helping them feel as though they have helped to create the space as well.
I want to see if there's any more questions in the room before I ask a closing question. Okay. So Kendall, I would love, you have a ton of resources available, and I kind of want to, this is a two-part question. Okay. So one, I'd love for you to just highlight those resources because they resource individuals as well as churches and just where to find those. And then could you send us off for your current like hope and vision for what really a ministry of food can be for us in our homes in this season, in our church, which I think is communicated through what you're creating through Edible Theology. So
yeah. So I run a ministry called Edible Theology. It is an educational media project that's helping people connect the communion table to the tables that we eat at every week. And so we have several different resources, all of which you can find on our website, edibletheology.com. But we have curriculum. So we have our two different forms of curriculum. One is called Bake with the Bible. It's a 6-lesson program on bread and the Gospels. Each lesson talks through a gospel story about bread, but then it also connects that story to different cultural and historical roles of bread. So you've got the sort of scripture lesson, the cultural historical lesson, a recipe, and then a variety of activities to address a range of ages and learning styles. So it is designed as a children's curriculum, but I have been told by many adults that they enjoy doing it on their own. We also have a self-guided teen program that I have also been told that adults really enjoy doing on their own. And so we have that available for individuals and families, but then also for churches. So if you are a pastor and are interested in something to implement in your church, then we have a church license as well. That's been used for Sunday school, it's been used for VBS, it's been used in a variety of ways. And then our other curriculum is called Worship at the Table. It is a program that is designed to help you think through how to start a dinner church service. So it's geared towards church leaders who are looking to think through how to start a meal in their community. How do you think through the gifts and the limitations of your context, and how to start a service that best sort of addresses the community and context that you're in. And then we also have a couple of two different digital communities. We have a free community, which you can find at community.edibletheology.com. It's a place for people to gather, share resources, share thoughts, ask questions, share recipes, what have you. And then within that, we also have a paid community called the Baker's Table, which is a space to learn how to bake as a spiritual practice. So you get weekly recipes, monthly workshops. We have a really cool Advent series about lamination. So if you've ever wanted to make homemade croissants and danishes and all that sort of thing, then you should join us for Advent. And then I have, last is our communications, mostly our podcast, which just launched this week. So it's a podcast called Kitchen Meditations. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. But if you listen right now, you should listen on Apple Podcasts because we're trying real hard to get into the top 10 on food. We're currently at number 11, so if you listen on Apple Podcasts, then go rate and review. We're trying really hard this week. And then my vision for, I truly believe, as you've probably gathered through this tonight, that by healing our relationship to food, then we can heal our relationships to our bodies, to community, to the church, and to God. And so I think that food is a really natural inroad to having lots of complex conversations and really thinking through lots of points of brokenness in the midst of creation. And so my vision in teaching about food and helping people think more nuanced ways about their relationship to food, that then the outpouring of that will be healing in many other different areas of life. And so that's the work that Edible Theology is trying to do, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. So I do have a benediction for us at the end, so I don't know if you were going to close us off or anything.
Before you offer that benediction, I just want to remind people that I highly recommend Kendall's book, We Will Feast. It's a really enjoyable read. Every chapter gives you a different picture of a different dinner church service and how they structure it and gather it. And I really enjoyed it, so it's just $10 tonight. I really encourage you to pick that up on your way out.
It's cheaper than Amazon.
Thank you for being here, and I'll let Kendall close us out.
Great. So as you feast together today and every meal you eat going forward, remember the bread and the wine. Remember Christ's body and blood, this death that brings the world back to life. Remember the interconnectedness of all of creation. Remember God's desire for this beloved world to flourish together. Remember that soon the triune God will restore creation once again, and there will be no more death and no more mourning. In the closing scenes of Revelation, this garden reappears, but only one tree stands at the center, the tree of life, a tree whose leaves can heal nations and that bears its fruit all year round. May we think of that tree and this bread and this wine in all of our eating moving forward.